Hello, Garland Nixon here, and there are new charges on Donald Trump. Let's talk about not so much the new charges, but the overall phenomenon that is the case against Donald Trump, or the series of cases against Donald Trump. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and just to update everybody, I will be back in Maryland tomorrow, Wednesday afternoon, which means that I won't be doing my Wednesday morning show with Scott Ritter. I'm going to catch up with Ritter today and see, as Cornell Westwood, I guess, call him Brother Ritter. I'm going to catch up with Scott and see if maybe we can, hopefully, maybe we can do Thursday morning or Friday morning, but. So just to update you on my schedule. All right, let's talk about Trump and the latest charges. Let's start here. I'm not going to get into the charges with Trump specifically or individually because there is an overall scheme that's going on here, right? Let's start here. And I could have kind of saw this coming. And one of them is the issue of RICO charges, racketeering influence in a corrupt organization, right? So racketeering, and for those of you who don't know what RICO charges are, it's pretty simple. Let's just say I go out here and I commit a crime. It's I rub a guy out. I'm a mafia hitman and I rub somebody out, right? When I rub that person out and the police catch me, they got me for, who knows, first degree murder, all kinds of charges that come along with it. And they, felonies are 10 years or more. So they may have me for 2 or 3 felonies. They may have me for using a handgun in the commission of a felony, possession of a handgun, murder, you name it, right? But, however, there's an additional charge that's often used when it comes to criminal organizations. It's even been used, I think, inappropriately for businesses at times, right? And that's RICO charges. And basically, in a nutshell, what it says is the crime that you committed, right? You rubbed out Joe Blow, or in this instance, somebody rubbed out Garland Nixon. It was a hitman, it was a mafia, right? But they rubbed out Garland Nixon, Joe Blow, whoever it was, in furtherance of the activity of a criminal organization, right? CO, RICO, racketeering influence corrupt organization or criminal organization, right? So what you say is Garland committed a crime, and therefore, whatever we charge him with, he can receive the additional, so many years we can give him for his crime. But because he did that in furtherance of the activities or outcome of a criminal organization, we will add an extra charge, which is your RICO charge, which now gives him another, whatever, 20 years, whatever the case may be. So that's what it is. So what they're arguing is Trump committed X crimes, but in furtherance of a criminal organization. That's one of the reasons that they had to add a bunch of people in there. In order to make that argument that it was a criminal organization, that it was some criminal group, they had to charge a bunch of other people along with him. A couple of things. They're over what you're seeing now, and this is very much a neoliberal kind of neoconservative kind of mentality. This aligns with the neoliberal neoconservative mentality, and that is what they've created is a narrative. These charges now all align with a particular narrative, and you could see that coming a mile away. The narrative is that our elections are clean and constitutionally sound, and that Trump and his evil band of evil minions all work to disrupt this constitutionally sound um, um, election. And so here's the other thing. Remember, afterwards, after the election, they said basically to go online and to argue that there was something wrong with the election would get you deplatformed, right? That it was basically the 2020 election. You weren't allowed to go online. You weren't allowed to make the argument that, hey, there was something wrong with the 2020 election. It was potentially corrupt. There was potential problems that was pushed back on. And remember, the whole Biden, what's the term I want to look for? Orbit, all talked about these MAGA election deniers, Trump and the election deniers. So they've been building a case for a long time that people who argued that the 2020 election was corrupt, was potentially problematic, was possibly even invalid, were involved in some kind of a criminal conspiracy to disrupt the chaste and pious election process of the United States. So that aligns with the argument they've been making all along, that the evil people are arguing that there's a problem with the election. But remember, prior to the election, we saw all kinds of, when they thought Biden might lose, we saw a lot of things such as um, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, everybody was interfering with the elections, right? We saw that everybody, the Martians, the Jew people, from the galaxy of Alpha Centauri, everybody in the world was interfering with elections. We saw that when they thought Biden might lose. As soon as Biden won, we saw articles that said, gee, I wonder why the Russians didn't try to interfere this time, or anybody. They just let it go. So leading up to the election, they stated the case that somebody might interfere, in case, of course, Biden lost. When Biden won, I say that in air quotes, they simply said, yeah, isn't it interesting? Biden won. And it was kind of like this. The fact that Biden won implies that the election was clean. If Biden lost, that would imply that the election was dirty. So the only way that the election would be deemed clean by the Biden orbitry, as it were, is if Biden won. He won, so therefore it was clean. Now, there are those of us who have made the arguments for years, irrespective of Donald Trump, irrespective of the 2016 or the 2020 election. There are those who have been making the argument since the voting machines came out, that forget Donald Trump, etc., that to utilize voting machines that have proprietary software for a corporation, that nobody can see how these voting machine works, that when the voting machines first came out, that John Hopkins demonstrated that it was very easy to hack these voting machines and change them. We bring into account, we bring into the conversation the reality that after the 2004 election, when there was a guy, his last name was, I believe, McConnell, you can look it up, and he worked for the Bush people. He worked for the Bush family for years. He was their tech guy. He was like their guy that did this computer stuff. And he was scheduled, you can look it up, he was scheduled to testify, and he had basically said, yeah, there's something wrong with the elections. Yeah, there was something wrong with the computers. And, he basically was scheduled to testify. And it appears that he was going to let the cat out of the bag, that something was rotten in Denmark when it came to the voting machines or the elections or something, right? So this guy's scheduled to do that. And 2 weeks before the election, before he was scheduled to talk in court, you know how the mafia works, he was in a small plane that mysteriously went down. And as they say, dead men don't tell tales. So there have been issues for years. There have been issues where tech guys met an untimely demise. There's a lot of, let me see what anybody's saying. So the bottom line is this. The argument is that only the MAGA Republican far right wingers could ever challenge and say the election is bad. There are those of us who long before 2016 said, and even in 2020, my argument when the conservatives and the MAGA people said, oh, they stole the elections and there was ballots in cars and all those kind of things, it was valid. It is always valid to challenge an election. To me, it is always valid to say, I want proof, I want details, we want to dig deep and make sure everything was okay. To me, if you've got a republic or democracy, whatever, there's an old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So if I was in charge of things and people said, we don't think there was a fair election, what Garland would say is this: let's look at everything. Let's open up the books. Let's do a complete investigation so that we can clarify to everybody, hey, it was or wasn't right. There was or wasn't problems. Let's look into it. So if you really believe that the election was sound, to me, the way to do it would be to say, look, the election was sound. Go ahead and look into it. Right now, if somebody said, well, Garland robbed the bank yesterday in East Sheboygan, I would say, I wouldn't say, don't look at it. Don't do an investigation. Don't check at all because I didn't do it. So you need to investigate. I'd say, well, go ahead and look into it. You'll find that I wasn't even in the state of what is Sheboygan, New Jersey, or whatever, wherever Sheboygan is. I'd say, go ahead and look. You'll find that I wasn't in Sheboygan yesterday. I could not possibly have. I was, whatever, 800 miles from Sheboygan. So feel free, look all you want to, and you'll find that I wasn't in Sheboygan because I know that I wasn't there, and an investigation is going to reveal that. Not saying, now, don't get me wrong. If they said we want to question you about the Sheboygan robbery yesterday, I would say, no, I'm sorry. I've got a Fifth Amendment right to not to say anything, and I'm never talking to you guys. So I wouldn't say anything. You always advise people never, ever, ever talk to police or anybody. If they come to you, you have a Fifth Amendment right. And I used to teach this, and I used to say to my students, look, if somebody says to you, anything you say can and will be held against you, why would you say anything? They're telling you, if you talk, we will use that to prosecute you. Whether you're guilty or not, whatever you say we'll use against you. When somebody says that to me, at that point, I say, well, I'm not saying anything. You have a right not to say anything. Exercise that right. So I wouldn't say anything, but I would say, you guys go ahead and look into it. I wasn't in the state, right? So if in fact the 2020 election was clean, the people in charge would just say it was clean, we'd be happy to look into it, and then we'll present the data to show you that it was clean. But they didn't do that, and they won't do that. I'm not going to say why. I'm just going to say that that's the best course of action, that would cause people to have confidence in the election if you were open and transparent. But it ain't happening. And again, my belief is always, as I've been saying for years, people on the left and right have been saying for years, look, we need to look more deeply into these machines, and we need to make it clearer, and we can't have we can't have a software in the election, I mean, in these machines that people don't allow to know what it is. Nobody can see the code. We know they can be hacked. Problematic. So my point there is that it wasn't implausible in a country where every single district, basically every jurisdiction, does their elections differently. It's not implausible to argue that there is potential problems in an election that disjointed and that screwed up. So it's not like it's a crime against God and nature to say, hey, I don't trust the elections from 2020, particularly in the context of US politicians, because we've spent the last 7 years with the Democratic Party saying the 2020 election was invalid because the Russians stole it, in spite of the fact that there's all arguments and evidence in that direction have been thoroughly debunked, and they still say it. So what they're saying is, for the last 7 years, we have argued that the 2020 election was invalid. And now we're going to charge the opposition party leader for arguing that the 20, excuse me, I don't know if I got my numbers right, but let me make it clear. For the last 7 years, in case I got it wrong, they've been arguing that the 2016 election was invalid, despite evidence to the contrary, or at minimum, despite evidence that their specific claims were not valid. They've been debunked, right? Okay. 7 years, they say the 2016 election is invalid. The 2020 election comes, and the opposition party says the same thing for different reasons. Hey, the 2020 election was invalid. And now they say, how dare you say the 2020 election was invalid? You're screwing up our country. You're messing everything up. How can you say that the 2020 election, that should be illegal, and you will be deplatformed and thrown off of YouTube and everywhere else for saying the 2020 election was invalid? Oh, by the way, did I remind you the 2016 election was invalid? So you can say that Hillary Clinton lost and she was cheated, but you can't say that Donald Trump lost and he was cheated. There's something inherently wrong and corrupt about that. Whether you like Trump or not, from the perspective of free speech, people should be able to say, I don't think the current election was valid. Now, let's go on. In Georgia, they're arguing that Donald Trump, like he called and said, find the votes, we're 160. This numbers aren't correct, but I'm just going to give you a for instance, as we used to say, a for instance. Donald Trump said, we're 160,000 votes behind, and find those 160,000 votes. Now, here's my interpretation of that. And remember, the numbers, everything, this is not exact, but I'm using that because that's basically what happened. Here's my argument. If Donald Trump had said, I lost by 160,000 votes, and I need you to fudge that. I need you to come up with some way where we can pretend that 160,000 votes exist, but we know they don't exist. Okay, you got a valid claim, right? But let me ask you this. I call over to your house and say, I left my glasses there. And you say, I don't think your glasses are there. And I say, I know they're there, find them. My glasses are in your house, find them. What does that mean? That means that I believe that they're there and they should be found. I didn't say go out and buy me a new pair of glasses. I didn't say go make me a pair, invent, create, pull out of thin air glasses. I said, I believe those glasses are there. Find them. What does find them mean? It means that something exists and you want somebody to find it. My argument, I guess, would be when Donald Trump said find them, that he thought they were there. That he thought, hey, man, I've been ripped off. And based on the other statements that Donald Trump said, it appears to me, valid or invalid, I believe that had Donald Trump argued that the machines are invalid, I would have agreed with him and said, yeah, he's got a good, strong argument there. But Donald Trump made a kind of, he didn't say that the machines weren't invalid, really. He made kind of a sweeping claim, a broad claim that he was robbed, that they stole the election, which means it could include allegations that it could include allegations that the machines were crooked. It could include allegations about virtually anything related to the election. So he didn't really pin it down. But in a nutshell, I think he said, find the, because remember, I think he said, find the votes. And in a judicial system wherein the burden of guilt is, if I'm going to find you guilty, it must be beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty for a criminal case. If somebody says, find the votes, and then they argue, I thought they were there. I didn't tell them make up the votes. I didn't tell them fudge the votes. I said, find the votes. I thought the votes were there. And I said, if you look hard enough, you'll find them. That was my in an environment where the standard for guilt is beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. If Trump argues, I said, find them, I thought they were there, it would be hard pressed for me to say, well, no, he didn't mean find them. He meant invent them. I think I'll put it like this. I think it's a strong enough defense that if I'm on the jury, I got to look at it and say, well, the man did say find them. It's hard for me to convict someone that says find that, not create, not make them up. So that being said, on that particular case, in that particular instance, that's my belief based on the wording. Let me add this. In the big picture, here's what we're seeing. And I think, as I've said before, I think Donald Trump also has another defense, which I've argued before, and that is Donald Trump argued that the election was invalid and that it was stolen, that it was improper actions were taken. The other defense is that there were improper actions taken. Therefore, when he claimed that he was robbed, there was enough validity to his claim that you can't say it was absurd and it was a travesty of justice and that he was outside of the bounds of reality. And what I think Donald Trump could argue, and I think it would be a strong argument, he would, what happens if Donald Trump argues that in fact there were actions taken that were extra constitutional and illegal, and that I go back to the FBI. If he argues that had voters known, there was a poll that said 17% of the people that voted for Joe Biden said if they knew about the Hunter Biden laptop case, that it would have affected their vote, right? 17%. Biden won by what, 1 or 2%? So clearly you can argue that that issue had an effect on the outcome of the election. And then when you make the argument that the FBI, which is under the Department of Justice, now if you say the same Department of Justice that is charging me is the same Department of Justice that had Hunter Biden's laptop for a year, but they didn't tell anybody that they had it. And think about this. When Donald Trump was charged, and he said Hunter Biden and Joe Biden are up to no good in Ukraine. They should be investigated because they're involved in illegalities potentially in Ukraine, and we need an investigation for that. He called for an investigation. And what they said was he's trying to weaponize the DOJ. He's trying to go after his political enemy. So he was impeached for that, right? But if Donald Trump argues that at the time that he was impeached, the FBI had exculpatory evidence, the Department of Justice had evidence to show that his claims about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden were in fact credible and plausible, then what he can say is the FBI, the Department of Justice, acted to withhold exculpatory evidence when I was impeached. They were actively withheld information, evidence that would have, well, he got off anyway, but that could have been used in my defense, so that the DOJ acted against him in an illegal way. They withheld his exculpatory information. He can also argue that they withheld the information from the laptop. They knew they had a Hunter Biden's laptop, and they knew that it implicated Hunter Biden in wrongdoing. Not only did they hide that, they went to the media. The FBI, the Department of Justice went to the media. The Department of Justice went to the social media platforms and said, you're not allowed to tell anybody about the Hunter Biden case, and it's Russian propaganda. And they knew all that was false. So now I argue that, in fact, the Department of Justice, not only am I correct in arguing that the 2020 election was constitutionally unsound, the same Department of Justice that's charging me now acted in a way that made it unsound. The Department of Justice had information, and they hid the information, and they censored people who tried to expose the information that would have made my argument, that makes my argument now valid, and that they deliberately, with malice and aforethought, interfered with the election. So now what I argue is that how can you say that me claiming that the election was invalid is a crime when I can demonstrate that it was? How can you say that me saying that there was actions taken to interfere with the election, that the election was stolen, is criminal and wrong when I have evidence to show that there was action taken by the same Department of Justice that's coming after me now? So I think Donald Trump has some valid defenses, but the bottom line is this. What I'm saying is, overall, the case against Donald Trump has taken shape. The first action against Donald Trump was part of this overall action, but it was simply they threw a punch at it, right? The first action against Donald Trump was in New York, where what was what lady's name? EJ something or other. She anyway, the woman that for those of you who are not familiar, I'll give you the short version. The woman that sued Donald Trump for sexual harassment, and the cases surrounding that, the issues surrounding that were pretty straightforward. She claimed that Donald Trump sexually harassed her, or whatever, sexually assaulted her 20 or 30 years ago, however long it was. But the statute of limitations in New York is not like 7 years, 10 years, however many years it is. So if you don't sue somebody within that period of time, you can't sue them. The statute of limitations is up. So the woman made a claim against Donald Trump, but she couldn't go after Donald Trump. She couldn't sue him because the law in New York said you only got 10 years, whatever, and it's been 20 or 30 years. I may not have the numbers right, but you get my point. So the New York legislature, the New York government came together and they changed the law. And they said, okay, she can't go after Trump. We're going to change the law so that she can. So they changed the law. And the second they changed the law, she filed her lawsuit against Trump. And nobody else has used that I know of, that I can find anywhere. Nobody else has used that law. So basically, the New York legislature changed the law specifically so one person could go after Donald Trump. The whole state changed the law to go after Trump. Regardless of what you think of Trump, that ain't fair. I wouldn't think that it would be reasonable for the state of Maryland to say, well, it's not valid or Garland did something and nobody can go after Garland for that, so we're going to change the law so that some people can go after Garland and nobody else. And to some extent, I think there's an argument to make that that's a constitutional violation. I don't know, because I'll put it like this: there's a constitutional concept known as ex post facto, after the fact. You cannot make a law and criminalize something after the fact, right? Ex post facto. You can't come in and say Garland threw a rock on Tuesday and it wasn't illegal. It was perfectly legal for him to throw the rock. So we're going to come in on Friday and we're going to make a law against throwing rocks, and we're going to go back and charge Garland because he threw a rock on Tuesday. That's ex post facto, after the fact. You can't criminalize something after it happened. To me, this is another form of ex post facto, where you're saying Donald Trump you can't go after Donald Trump. Time is up, game over, goodbye. Now we're going to go back and change the law and say, okay, now you can. The law was clear. You couldn't go after Donald Trump. We're going to now change the law so you can go after Donald Trump after the, what do you call it? After the statute of limitations has gone up. To me, it's now whether or not it's legally actionable, whether or not you can make that, because that constitutional protection is from the federal government against ex post facto laws. Well, but now the states can't do it either. But whether or not you can also apply that to a civil charge that is being brought by a individual plaintiff is questionable, but I think it's worth pushing. But who knows, it may not be valid. But I'll put it like this: as is often said in legal circles, the spirit of the law is violated by the ex post facto actions within the New York the New York State Legislature, in my humble opinion. So, and this somebody else makes a point here: what's important, law or justice? I always bring that issue up, the issue of justice or injustice, right? And when in fact a legislature makes a particular law or changes a law to go after one specific person, to me that's unjust, because the legislature is supposed to act in the best interest of the citizen. And just to say go after one person, what happens to people who want to go after somebody else for something else? What if I want to go after somebody because they hit me in the head 5 years ago and it's past the statute of limitations, and I go to the legislature and I say, can I go after the person? No, we're not changing the law for you. We only changed it for this lady so she could go after Trump. That's the unfairness of it. They won't do it for other people, and they only did it for her because they could specifically go after Trump. So there is an ex post facto injustice there, in my opinion. But continuing on, we'll have, let's see, 20. So I only got about 3 or 4 more minutes. So my point being, they've decided what they're going to say is that Donald Trump and his people tried to illegally in a criminal organization, and it's got to be informal because there's no evidence that Donald Trump had a formal syndicate or a formal group or a formal organization, and that formal organization was working together. They named themselves with the Trump gang or something, and they tried to overturn the election. So they're going to argue that it was an informal group organization, which will be interesting for RICO, because now you're saying informal organizations can be considered a corrupt organization. We'll see how that ends up in the Supreme Court. But an informal organization, a de facto, that's basically what they're going to say, a de facto corrupt organization. Were all making, and they were an organization because they were all making the same claim. And to me, they're going to have to show that those claims were wholly and completely invalid, preposterous, and absurd. And that's where I think they're going to have some problems. If I was defending that, I would really push at the argument that I can demonstrate that in fact the 2020 election was constitutionally unsound. That's what I would go at. I would go with all the evidence I could, not to mention the fact that I could utilize that to get all of the, when you file the interrogatories under discovery, interrogatories or questions, I would go after that. A lot of my questions would be about things involving the FBI, things involving the Hunter Biden laptop, who said what, when. I would depose the people who went to the social media platforms. I would depose the people from the social media platforms and the news. I would do, depose, have them come in and speak. I would do everything that I could to get everything out there as to how the Department of Justice specifically acted to interfere with the election, how they specifically acted in a manner that any reasonable and prudent person, as they say in law, right, that any reasonable and prudent person who looked at what they're doing would say they acted to interfere with the election, and that their actions did in fact have an effect on the election. When it came to the unabridged laptop, I would push that if I was the defense. Of course, I ain't the defense, but I do. But personally, I just think it's a valid defense. I think they're going after Trump, and they're saying this de facto organization worked in a corrupt way to overturn the election. And they're going to argue that January 6th was the consummation of that. That the January 6th, that people went in wandering around that they tried to overturn the election. And that another part of that was Trump calling, saying, find the votes. They're going to put all this together for, as the neoliberals and neoconservatives love to do, create a narrative. Whether it's Ukraine, we create a narrative. The narrative is Assad is evil and he's doing evil things. Putin's evil and he's doing evil things. Maduro is evil. There's always the leader of a country that's evil, and that therefore that he's doing evil things, and that justifies our intervention in somebody else's country, right? That's the way it works. Now the narrative is Donald Trump worked illegally to overturn a valid and constitutionally sound election, which again, I think if you launch a defense, and the defense is that it was not valid, and it was not, at minimum, that it wasn't constitutionally sound, and that the Department of Justice themselves, the people that are charging me, if I'm Donald Trump, were in fact the people who acted to interfere with the election, I both create a defense that the election was unsound, and I create an informal assertion that the people that are going after me are doing it for political reasons, which I think is a valid assertion, at least from the perspective of the defense team. It is a valid and something that I think you'd want to run with. So what we're seeing now is the people who told us for the last 7 years that the 2016 election was invalid, that it was stolen, that it was robbed, that the president was illegitimate, are now saying that we're going to charge the former president and members of his team, members of his supporters, we're going to charge them criminally with claiming that the subsequent election was invalid, illegal, and that they didn't lose. That we did it for 7 years, and now we're going to charge them criminally for doing what we did for the last 7 years. It aligns with the way of the neocons think. You know what I mean? We can do it. It aligns with this American exceptionalism crap that says we can go to a country, we can overthrow the government, we can steal all of their stuff, we can sanction them, we can do everything else. And if any other country tries to do what we're doing, even on a considerably lesser basis, that will scream, look what they did, they've done, they've acted in a way that's immoral, illegal, and unethical. And when they say, well, wait a minute, you guys overthrew the country of Iraq, you overthrew the country of Libya, and we go on and on and on and say, you guys overthrew all these governments, stole the stuff, installed the puppet government, and now you're going to say somebody else is wrong for doing what the United States has done over and over and over and over again. That is why so many countries right now in the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, and Latin America are angry at the US and are pushing back against us. And we're going to have long-term problems. People are backing away from using the dollar. We're going to have long-term problems because the US is making that argument. But particularly the countries of the world, Latin America, Asia, Middle East, Africa, are now saying, nah, we don't like that dynamic, and we're going to push back against it. So we're in a position where we've been doing that to the world, and now a huge portion of the world, I would say the majority of the world, are saying they feel that's unfair and unjust, and they're not going along with it. And I've said all along, the war on terror that people supported, be wary of that, because whatever the U.S. empire, whatever a country does externally, they'll do internally. I've said this many times, and those of you who watch my channel understand. The difference between foreign policy and domestic policy is grammatical. If you run into a man and that man goes to the bar and he gets in a fight, And on the way home, he screams and yells at some guy on the road, and he pulls over and he gets in a road rage incident and he gets in a fight. Then he comes home and his neighbor's parked too close to his driveway and he screams at his neighbor and he gets in a fight, right? Everywhere. When he goes in the house, he's going to beat the crap out of his wife and kids. Why? Anybody that fights in the street, fights in a bar, fights everybody everywhere, when they come home, he's not going to be a gentle guy. He's going to be violent against his family too. This is a person who's violent, of a violent nature, and that violence will be anywhere. I say that of our foreign policy. When you see a government that does things around the world, when you see the way they act against other countries, against other people, right? At some point, that the difference between foreign policy and domestic policy is in grammar. It is in the words we use. Effectually, there's no difference. So the things that they're doing around the world, we can do this and you can't. We can make these claims and you can't. We can create a narrative that the leader of this country is evil and therefore it's okay to sanction, it's okay to overthrow that government, the country, to go attack a bomb or whatever we want. When they do that around the world, it's just a matter of time before it's coming home. And so now we have a very unstable situation, which is kind of concerning here. As a person here, I don't want violence. I don't want civil war. I don't want people flipping out and freaking out. I want a nice, stable country where people can disagree, where people can vote or whatever, but where there's no violence and there's no, political instability. But when you have a circumstance where the leader of the opposition party, whatever you think about Donald Trump is irrelevant. Right now, he's the leading candidate of the Republican Party. I looked, Donald Trump is at 54% when it comes to his numbers going into the election. For the Republican Party, 54%. The closest person to him is DeSantis, and he's somewhere between, depending upon the poll, between 11 and 15%. Donald Trump has a 39 to 40%, maybe 40% lead over number two. So that's over. Donald Trump is the leader of the I don't care what you think about him. If you ain't a Republican, it don't matter. You ain't voting. Donald Trump is the leader of the opposition party. And the incumbent party, facing in an opposition leader that there's a good chance that they would lose to, takes the initiative to come up with highly questionable charges against this guy and to go after him from one end of this country to the other, politically destabilizing. That's what that is. They should just go against Trump and beat him, but it's destabilizing. And it's could create political and potentially social instability in this country that, those of us who live in this country who want a stable country that we can wander around in have to have great concern about. That they throw Trump in jail, or they try to say he can't run. There could potentially be violence in this country. Trump supporters could flip out, and I'm opposed to violence, but I'm just saying the people, when you have an opposition figure that half the people in the country at least support, it's a very dangerous idea to simply say we're going to lock this guy up and stop him from being able to run. Keep in mind something. What did we just find out about Pakistan? What we found out about Pakistan is, in the last few days, the leading political figure, the most popular politician in Pakistan, a guy named Imran Khan, was the prime minister, president, whatever you want to call him. And that the United States government went in there and basically overthrew him and had him taken out and paid people off and did all the things they needed to do to ensure, threatened, and got this guy thrown out of office. So we now know that one of the most populous countries in the world, over 200 million people in Pakistan, a very, very populous country, that the U.S. went in and said, your prime minister, your leader needs to go, and worked to get this guy out of office. That's unthinkable. Those people in Pakistan have a right to choose their leader. But that was foreign policy. Now look at home. The most popular leader of the opposition party, what are they doing? They're doing the exact same thing. Exact same thing. Niger, the people of Niger have decided that they want a new leader. 60 to 70% of the people in Niger support the new government. Democracy says, leave them alone, let them get their government. But the U.S. is saying, no, we may have to attack Niger. The people want that government, but the U.S. doesn't like it because it doesn't let us steal their stuff. It doesn't let us take their uranium and their gold. So that we have to have somebody in charge who we like. Those things are very dangerous and destabilizing for Niger and for the continent of Africa. So we're destabilizing Africa. We're destabilizing Eurasia or West Asia, where Pakistan is. So it only stands to reason that the same things would happen here. And I'll finish up by saying this. I think what we're looking at is something out of desperation, wherein the government that we have basically is concerned that if Trump or someone else, RFK Jr., whoever, right, if someone that would come in office that's not part of their team and would say, okay, you know what, we're going to bring in an impartial investigator and have him look into what the FBI has been doing. They can't afford that because there's too many crooked things going on. If somebody says, we're going to look at what the Biden team has been doing, well, we know that Joe Biden's son went to Ukraine and started making a fortune in Romania and China and everywhere, anywhere he could make a fortune. We know that Pelosi's kids were there. We know that Romney's kids were in Ukraine getting paid. We know that all of these people that John Kerry's stepson was in Ukraine. They cannot afford the government that we have that is corrupt, cannot afford to have somebody come into office that would actually look at that stuff. It is desperation. They got to do anything they can to stop it. Why? Because if somebody starts looking at it, they all go to jail. But they don't go to jail, right, theoretically. But what if somebody looked, it would demonstrate the fundamental corruption, the ubiquitous, the broad corruption that's going on in the United States government. And people would start asking questions that they can't afford to ask. What happens if somebody comes in, be it Trump or anybody, and says, look, the American people have been asking where all of the money went that was going to Ukraine and why we sent $100 billion to Ukraine and the government of Ukraine was out buying crypto, investing in a crypto scam, the FTX scam. We're sending money to them supposedly for war, and they're taking it and investing in a crypto scam. So if a new president would say, we need to look into that, they can afford that because they'd find out that the government was involved, that people were filling their pockets. There's just so much corruption. They can't afford to have, whether it's Trump, RFK Jr., Cornel West, anybody. They cannot afford to have somebody come in who's going to look at that level of corruption. It's pretty crappy and unfortunate. At any rate, I'm out of time. Let me look and see if there are any super chats. If there are any super chats, I'm going to answer them, and then I shall run on about my business. Let me see. At this point, no super chats, no questions. What's the middle of the day here where I am? So what do we got? Wow, we still got 458 people watching. That's fantastic. Usually these videos you don't have as many people watching, because people love mostly the Ukraine stuff. But this is important. Okay, next, let me look at Rockfin. Same thing. Well, we got 37 people watching there. No questions, nothing. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody. And do me a favor. If you can afford to, buymeacoffee.com is a place. It's very easy to support the channel there. It just says, buy Garland a coffee. How much? $5, and it'll say how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, however many you want. You can do that way to contribute to the channel. And I might add, Buy Me a Coffee is just like Patreon now. You can actually say, I want to be a monthly contributor of $5, whatever it is. So if you can Buy Me a Coffee, that's greatly appreciated. Patreon, of course, you can do that. You can do PayPal. And of course, you can do Cash App to donate to the channel. Additionally, go to rockfin.com/Garland Nixon, so that for some reason I'm not on YouTube. YouTube closes down. They throw me off YouTube, anything like that. Rockfin is available. You can go there. It costs nothing to become a member if you choose, and if you can afford it. I would ask that you support, go on to rockfin.com and become a subscriber. That's $14.99 a month. You can join a year and they give you 2 free months. So it comes down to $12.40 something a month. If you can afford it, with Rockfin, that'd be highly appreciated. If you can, I understand it. Just become a member. Make sure you share all of this stuff on all of your social media platforms. Thank you. Peace. I'm out.